This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 729, entitled, "It Takes a Country to Raise a Child." Description. This flyer makes the case why governments need to spend an amount on maternity wages that is comparable with the amount they spend on their national defence. The flyer itself. It Takes a Country to Raise a Child, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Probably most of you reading/watching this have heard of the expression, "It takes a village to raise a child," meaning essentially that a mother has a much easier time finding a babysitter in a village than in a modern nuclear family-oriented society. So the title of this flyer is based on this expression and is used to convey the idea that it's easier for people to have children if the parents are supported by the efforts of a whole nation, that is, by a nation's taxes. The point behind this flyer is trying to find solutions to the greatest existential threat of our times, namely the crash in the birth rate, which threatens to wipe out whole populations. The underlying cause of this threat is feminism, based on the following reasoning. Modern monoconscious feminism has made young women so undateable for young men that in the US, for example, 2/3 of them refuse to even date young women, finding them undateable due to being too poisoned by feminism. This dating strike of young women by young men, at least in the US, is not the only cause of the crash in the birth rate. Other factors are the costs of having a child, the costs of buying a house, the careerist preference of women, etc. But the fact that 2/3 of young men in the US refuse to even date young women is the dominant cause in the crash in the birth rate, given the high proportion of young men who choose not to date young women, hence not sex them, hence not have kids, thus being the major cause of why the birth rate is so well below the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. So, how to overcome this problem? How can men be persuaded to date young women again? Obviously, monoconscious feminism must be eliminated, which is where masculism comes in. Masculist ideas are very powerful, so they can be used to persuade millions of women who are currently monoconscious feminists to become biconscious feminists. To be biconscious means that one has had both one's feminist and one's masculine consciousness raised. That is, one is familiar with both sets of gender political arguments. That is, that one is aware that gender oppression is very much a two-way street. That is, that women oppress men too, which is something monoconscious feminists assiduously avoid saying. Not only do masculists claim that gender oppression is a two-way street, they also claim that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, since many of women's gender crimes against men are horrible and last decades, making them a lot more serious than the relatively mild ways that men oppress women, that the feminists keep harping on. Masculists talk about the big three ways that women oppress men, that is, the worst three ways that women oppress men, namely women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, and women's forced fathering. Anyone giving some thought to these big three can agree how horrible they are as gender crimes. Masculists need to spread their ideas widely across the planet so that the planet becomes bi-conscious, thus converting monoconscious feminists into bi-conscious feminists. Once millions of monoconscious feminists have become bi-conscious, they will accept the idea that relative to someone who is bi-conscious, that is, who accepts the idea that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, then when that person sees a monoconscious feminist trashing men in public for men's oppression of women, that monoconscious feminist will be seen as an utter hypocrite, a bigot, as someone who is blind to the idea that women oppress men far worse, and be very conscious how hypocritical her attitude is. It's the experience of many masculists that once a former monoconscious feminist becomes bi-conscious and loses her monoconscious feminist hypocrisy, then she becomes a lot nicer for men to be with, since typically a monoconscious feminist is rather feminazi bitchy towards men because she's angry at men for the ways that men oppress women, as taught her by monoconscious feminism. By becoming bi-conscious, she has her feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women cancelled, in capital letters, by her female masculinist anger at women for the worse ways that women oppress men. By losing her feminazi anger at men, she'll be a lot more likely to be dateable again, to have and especially to keep a boyfriend. Men will find her a lot more approachable and hence will approach her, because such a woman is actually nice to men and like men's company, in contrast to a monoconscious feminist, whom to masculists and to men in general is seen as a misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi cunt. Millions of young men in the US have voted with their feet and have chosen to have nothing to do with such monoconscious feminists, forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless and spat at, utterly rejected both socially and sexually. So in a bi-conscious world, relations between the two sexes will be a lot healthier, but this will not be anywhere near enough to solve the crash in the birth rate problem. A major prerequisite for the solving of the birth rate problem is the fipping of women, the creation of a FIP society, which is one of the major political goals of the masculists, who look on fluffies and fluffy feminists as enemies to be exterminated by being totally ignored. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man's slaves to women for decades of their lives. Masculists are abolitionists who see man's slavery as literally 1,000 times worse than was Negro slavery in the US in the early 1800s. Abolitionism was the core issue that created the Civil War in the US. Analogously, masculists are at war against fluffies and fluffy feminists, seeing fluffies as man-slaving, divorce-raping vermin to be exterminated by being totally ignored, not even pumped and dumped by most men, who in the coming years will be influenced by masculist ideas and will be infected by the masculist virus. Masculists have a particular hatred against divorce-raping women who butcher their fathering husbands in the fluffy, monoconscious, feminist-dominated divorce courts. Young men in most Western countries now are aware how toxic these divorce courts are to men, to divorcing fathers, so avoid marriage and paternity because they refuse to face a 1 chance in 4 of being butchered in one of these courts. Because divorce is so toxic for married fathers, they see marriage and paternity as toxic for men. To get young men to be prepared to be fathers again, some major restructuring of society needs to be undertaken, which is where masculist politics comes in. Masculists are horrified by the massiveness of the divorce butchery of men in many countries. 1 father in 4 is thus butchered. 1 in 4. That's hundreds of millions of men. a massive problem, hugely more serious than the rather minor ways that men oppress women. Society needs to be fundamentally restructured so that this divorce court butchery can be stopped. This can be done by masculisting society, by the fipping of women, by the creation of a FIP society in which both sexes, especially young girls, are socialized and educated to be FIPs, that's financially independent persons, by bothering to get a career competent education so that as adults women are not fluffies, not parasites of the money and labour of a man slaving him for decades. So, the solution to the butchery of one father in four in the feminist-dominated divorce courts, which see women as fluffies who have to be paid for by men, both before and after the divorce, is to create a culture in which both sexes are FIPs. The divorce courts need to be based on the principle of financial independence of both divorcing parties. That is, the divorcing mother is assumed to be a FIP, so that after a divorce she is assumed to be capable of supporting herself financially because she is a FIP. Custody of children will be given jointly by default, so FIP ex-wives and FIP ex-husbands are in the same financial boat in terms of earning capacity. Both are assumed to be FIPs. But this still leaves the problem of how to ensure the creation of the next generation. That is, who raises the kids, which is the main topic of this flyer. If most women prefer to have their careers and as a result not have more than one kid, then we wipe ourselves out, which is the greatest of all existential threats to humanity. This is the end of part 1.